Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik with Figure It Out Productions. The following video is part of our Quick Shoot series.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and welcome to part 4 of my third video game generation retrospective. Part 1 was on the generation as a whole, part 2 was on the Nintendo Entertainment System, part 3 was on the Sega Master System, and part 4, the final part, is on the Atari 7800. One of history's most lackluster video game consoles? I don't know, for lack of a better word, I think that's the only way to really put it. This console is interesting for quite a few different reasons. So let's talk a little bit about the history of it, and then we'll talk about some experience stuff, and of course the games, etc. Now, the console itself, I think, is interesting because depending on how you define it, it's either the first or the last entrance of the main three in that generation. So, alright, here's the thing. The NES, of course, didn't come out here in North America until widely until 1986. Late 1986, like September of 86. Whereas it had a test release in 1985 in New York City only. Which is another thing that this generation is known for, was test releases. Because the Sega Master System essentially had a test release in Japan as the Sega Mark III. After it was successful, it was brought here as the Master System and then brought back to Japan as the Master System. While, on the other hand, the Atari 7800 had a test release in California only in 1984. So the Famicom, aka the NES in Japan, comes out in 83. I know this is kind of confusing, but it's just how it is. It came out in 83 in Japan, but not until, technically you could say 85 in North America. But in North America, the Atari 7800 came out in 84, technically. 2 years before, or even a year before the NES. But then, the Atari 7800 didn't have a wide release until 1986. And it wasn't fully released until 1987. So it's like, was that first or last? It's all bullshit, basically. It's all up to your personal preference. But the point of that is that because the Atari 7800 actually does go all the way back to 84, that created some problems. So how did that happen? Basically, the way I see it, the Atari 7800 is kind of that last vestige of the Wild West frontier of video game consoles that I described in part 1 of this series. Basically meaning a company could just get in, make a game console, just throw it out there, and who knows what'll happen? Chaos. There's no rules, it wasn't very well regulated, etc. I think this is the last console from that type of era. And part of the reason for that is when Atari was in their prime in the 2600 and they were super successful, they wanted to upgrade their hardware. They didn't know how the market would react to that, and they didn't really seem to give a shit. They made the Atari 5200, which did not last long and was a colossal disaster. And so they're like, alright, that didn't really work. Let's just throw another one out there and see how that goes. That console would ultimately prove to be the Atari 7800. So that's what they were in development of. Now, they were really far along in that process, and then in 1983, the game industry completely crashed. So I don't know the exact specifics of how this worked, but obviously they delayed it a little bit. And then in 1984, they did the test release in California. After they did that, Jack Tramiel bought Atari, just came in and said, fuck video game consoles, that's over. That should be really obvious to you guys based on last year. We're certainly not going to release this thing. We're going to focus on home computers instead. He didn't give a shit about game consoles anymore. So they basically shelved it. And if you have one of those original Sunnyvale versions of the console, that could have ended up being a really rare item. But since they ultimately did do a wider release, I guess it doesn't matter as much. Now, I actually think this is not the... Yeah, this is the 1986 version that was made in Taiwan, which you can tell when you look on the back. It'll say if it was made in Sunnyvale, California, then you know you have one of the original versions, I guess. But anyway, so a lot of people assume that the reason that the Atari 2600 did eventually get a wider release is because Nintendo put out the NES and it was like super popular, and then they went, oh shit, we should do something. It's not exactly accurate. See, what happened was that in 1986, I don't know exactly what Jack Tramiel's sudden change of heart came from, but he decided to release the Atari 7800 in May of 1986. Now, it's possible that that New York test run of the NES made him go, okay, there's hope. But the NES didn't get its wide release until later in 1986, until I believe again it was September of 86. So by that account, this was out many months before that. So that's interesting. And I think that's another reason that this happened, this disaster of a controller. So the controller. Fuck, man. All right, so Atari was known for the joystick type of controller with like a single button. It worked for them with the 2600, which is no doubt why they kind of kept that. The 5200, of course, had history's worst controller, and I mean that with the exception of like the build quality of cheap Chinese knockoff clone consoles or whatever. Of all the main ones, the Atari 5200 controller is by far the worst. By far. Not only in build quality, but functionality and just, you know, difficulty of use. It's an irritating controller. So when they brought this one over, this is the 7800 controller. It is not the same, although people often think the 7800 controller and the 5200 controller are the same thing. They are very much not. The build quality on this controller is fine. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just a shitty design. You know, it's awkward to try and play with this. So people are like, well, why didn't they use like a D-pad controller like the NES? Well, it's because it came out months before the NES, and because the NES was the first controller to have a D-pad. Like, yes, the Famicom had it, but that was in Japan only. We didn't know about the damn D-pad over here. Now, Europe got lucky because by the time Europe got the Atari 7800, the NES had already come out in North America, and the D-pad was the thing. So in Europe, they released a totally different looking controller. Now, why Atari didn't retroactively throw that back into the Atari 7800 and say, all right, new versions of it will be sold with that controller, and you know we'll sell the controller separately. Why they never did that in North America is completely beyond me. Unfortunately, I don't own that controller. I would love to own it. It's way better. I've been to Europe a few times, and every time I have the chance to go into some sort of game store and look for it, I sometimes will ask and they'll be like, no. They never have it. It's never a thing. Sega Genesis controllers use the same DIM9 port that the Atari 7800 and 2600 use. As a result, a lot of people think that you can use Sega Genesis controllers on either one of those consoles, which is only half true. You can use them on the 2600, no problem, but you can only kind of use them on the 7800. If you try to, it'll work with all the 2600 games because of the backwards compatibility, but if you try to play a 7800 game on the 7800 with a Genesis or Mega Drive controller, it won't work. Why? I don't know. It's just how it is. I think that one of the problems with the 7800 was really that it never had a chance, and I think that was largely Atari's fault because they clearly didn't have much faith in it. Now, part of the proof of that is that when they re-released it in 1986, they had the opportunity to make upgrades because nobody had the 1984 version. You could have made changes to the console, but they were too cheap to do it. For example, this console is backwards compatible with the 2600. It's probably its biggest selling point, but that meant that it needed 2600 hardware in there. Specifically, the sound processor is exactly the same as the Atari 2600 sound processor, which means all the games made for the 7800 have to use exactly the same sound hardware that they used in the Atari 2600 from 1977. That's pretty bad that they didn't upgrade that. As far as other aspects of technical prowess, it's on par with the NES. It's not quite as advanced, but it's right around there. It might, well, in some ways it might be more advanced because again, the NES was technically the Famicom, which came out a year earlier. But the sound hardware is shit. They also didn't update it to support anything other than RF, which in 1984, okay, I guess, but by 86, that's kind of unforgivable to not have at least composite on board. To only have RF at that point is kind of shitty. I mean, again, at that point, the Sega Master System had RGB SCART built in. It's just crazy. On the back, it has this unique power supply, which was really dumb. Voltage isn't that big of a deal. It's just that the shape of it is this weird, like, two-prong thing that only this console used. And since this console didn't sell particularly well, there aren't a whole lot of the power supplies out there. So, yeah, good luck finding a power supply by itself. You would best be buying the console with a power supply. Now, fortunately, it's not that difficult to mod this and put, like, a Genesis power supply jack on there and use that. But the fact that you have to do that is a pain in the ass. Also, Atari put in a very small marketing budget for this thing, which is no doubt another reason it did very, very poorly. Not many people even knew it existed. I think Atari had no chance of success in North America because of what Nintendo's monopolistic business practices were. I think they felt they had a better chance in Europe, probably also another reason that they got the D-pad, because Nintendo wasn't really gaining any traction there, but ultimately Sega beat them out there as well. So, unlike the NES, which was able to take Japan and take North America, and the Master System, which was able to take Europe and take South America, the Atari 7800 really never found a place. And as a result, it really wasn't around very long. It actually was discontinued on, I believe it was January 1st, 1992, the exact same day that the Atari 2600 was discontinued, which tells you a lot. The console itself, it's not a bad-looking console. It looks very 80s, which is appropriate. That's when it was released. It definitely was a big visual upgrade over the Atari 2600, which obviously looked very 70s, and I think they captured that perfectly fine. On board, it has a reset button, a select button, a pause, and a power switch. The power switches are known for being defective. They're not that big of a deal to replace and fix, but they're known for kind of sticking, and it's unfortunate. Now, as I mentioned, its biggest selling point was the fact that it was backwards compatible with the 2600, which should have been huge for them. But without at least putting a composite port on there, it's like, what's the point? If I already have a 2600, the 7800 is not doing anything special for that library. It just still plays them the same way. So I think they could have had a better console there. They could have had better sales if they'd been like, hey, the 2600 games, you'll put them in here, they'll look better. They could have done that, but they didn't. There was a lot of things announced for this that never happened, like modems. A Laserdisc player at one point was announced. Yes, believe it or not, there was going to be an add-on for a Laserdisc player that would have gone to the expansion port there. None of that shit ever surfaced. Not surprising, because the console, again, it really wasn't around for very long. It really, really wasn't very successful, which is a shame, but it is what it is. Most people use it as a more, I guess you might say a more reliable Atari 2600, just because it's newer. Although, really, I've never had that many problems getting an Atari 2600 to read games, so it's whatever. It obviously had its own library of games, but it was substantially smaller. But I want to show you some of them. I have more than what you're seeing here, but nevertheless, I do want to show you these. I just wanted to pick out a couple of highlights for different reasons. The first is Pole Position 2, just a racing game. This was packed standard with the console. Again, I think one of the reasons that this console suffered a bit is Atari 7800 games are pretty indistinguishable from Atari 2600 games. I mean, unless you know to look for the word Pro System or the word 7800, you're going to think it's the same damn thing. They just didn't do a very good job. I mean, they use the same molds and everything. It's super cheap. And that's unfortunate because that's how it comes off. And it's a large part of the reason that it probably failed is they just clearly didn't have much faith in this console. And it's like, if you don't have that much faith in it, why did you put the effort in? Either go all the way or don't fucking do it at all. But anyway, another reason, no doubt, was that if you had a 2600, you wouldn't have much reason to upgrade unless they had all sorts of great exclusive titles that were much better than what Nintendo could offer you. Which is not what they did. They basically took a lot of the same games everybody already knew and just made more advanced versions. For example, Robotron 2084. Perfectly fine game, but a game that people had seen many times on different platforms. Joust, same damn thing. Asteroids, same damn thing. Interestingly, you might have noticed also that they have gray labels. Very cheap. Again, another sign they were just trying to save money and didn't have much faith in the product, which is too bad. Now, there were some games that I was very lucky to pick up very recently that I still am very surprised ever made their way to the console. Donkey Kong, which is color, by the way, you might have noticed, released by Nintendo in 1988. I don't get that, to be honest with you, because at that point the NES was huge. I don't know why the hell Nintendo would have put this on there. I don't know exactly. I can't imagine Nintendo did that themselves. I think that they had some old deal or something where Atari was allowed to do it and Nintendo probably didn't want them to but couldn't stop them. I'm betting that is more likely. Donkey Kong Jr., same deal, colored, also Nintendo. And of course, Mario Bros. Arcade game. This is not Super Mario Brothers like the NES game. This is the arcade game. I'll show you some screenshots here. It's different. It's like these turtles pop out and you have to like knock them and then hit this POW thing and kill them. It's a very different game. It does also exist on the NES, incidentally. I like this console. I do. I just feel that it really never got a chance. It would be very interesting to see what could be accomplished with it, what kind of games it could have had, how much fun it could have been, if it had really had more money and more developers and more customers behind it. But I mean, I'm not totally guiltless or anything in that. I mean, I wish I had some story from childhood or something to tell you, be like, oh, I had a friend who had this. You know. No. When I was a kid, I did have an Atari 2600. That's actually my first console ever. I did not know about the 7800. I didn't learn about the 7800 until I was maybe in high school. And I was learning about, of course, things retroactively. And I always wanted one, just kind of for collector's sake. But to be honest with you, there's no games on there where I was like, that's why I need a 7800. I think I actually, if I recall correctly, I actually picked up this. This is my only 7800. I picked it up a few years ago at, I think it was a video game store in Madison, Wisconsin. Guy had it, power supply, controller, came with a couple of free games. And I think he only wanted like 20 or 40 or something like that for the box and everything. I was just like, alright, probably not going to get a better deal than that. Screw it. And I picked it up. And I've played it. It looks technologically comparable to the NES and the Master System. The sound is shit for reasons previously explained. But again, there's just nothing on this console that makes you go, holy shit, yes, 7800. I don't know anyone who ever had one of these. The only story I've even ever heard about someone buying one of these that was interesting is Mark from Classic Game Room. I guess when he was a kid, he was presented with the option of getting an NES or the 7800, and he actually said, oh, well, I have a 2600, I'll just get a 7800. And the fact that that's probably the most interesting story says a lot. To the modding community, though, this is a much more interesting console because it, of course, can be modded for composite. It can also be modded for S-Video. I don't know about RGB SCART. I've never heard anyone say they successfully did that, but I have heard people claim success with S-Video, which does require additional parts. Then you actually have you'll probably have the best 2600 you can possibly get, because then your games will look really, really good, as well as, of course, the 7800 games. And that's probably its longest lasting legacy, is that it can make your 2600 games look better if you're really good at modding, but that's kind of it. There you go, guys. That is, in a nutshell, the Atari 7800. And that's also the end of the third generation series. I hope you've enjoyed it. I've enjoyed making it for you. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you all later.